This week I thought we'd have a look at my Benelli TnT. I bought this in 2007. It's a 2006 model, which is only a couple of years into the run of TnTs. The first one came out in 2004. Now, there are a couple of differences between the first model and this, in that the early models didn't have the power control button on the dash, and the initial ones were released with the fans on the inside of the radiators rather than on the outside, as seen here 2 years later. In 2006, when I bought this, there were three models available. There was the standard model, which was pretty much unchanged from the earlier model. There was the Cafe Racer, which had clip-on bars, an adjustable front suspension, whereas the stock model didn't have adjustable front forks, and a seat cowl. And then at the top of the tree at the time was the TnT 1130 Sport, which is what this is, which had the fully adjustable 50mm Marsocchi suspension on the front and a fully adjustable Satch shock on the back. And it also had these radial mounted brake calipers. Now, the TnT is derived from the motor that came out originally in the Tornado, which was a 900cc motor. They stroked it, and in doing so improved the torque output of the motor, and it's listed as having 147 brake horsepower, but at the wheel it's probably 20 to 30 horsepower less than that. But in saying that, it is a very spirited ride. I mean, at the time I rode the Benelli, the Cagiva Raptor, a Ducati Monster, and the Aprilia Tuono. I was sort of looking for another Italian bike, to replace a Moto Guzzi I had at the time, and I really wanted something quite different. And of all the bikes I rode at the time, this had the nicest handling and braking and power delivery. It was just a beautiful, complete package. And I can say unreservedly that these motorcycles are a delight to ride. The throttle response on these is a little bit snatchy low down, and the clutch can be a bit, it's a bit heavy really, and it can be difficult to find neutral, but for country riding on twisty roads, this is an absolute delight. Another thing that attracted me towards the TnT was the design. I mean, when this came out in 2004, this was probably the most striking naked bike that I had ever seen. This sort of Transformer slash I guess praying mantis style has become quite common now, and a lot of the Japanese nakeds and European nakeds sort of follow this angular sort of styling. The only thing that really dates the styling of this motorcycle 10 years later is the fact that it's got an underseat exhausts, which have fallen out of favour and are rarely seen today. But one look at the frame, which is sort of this beautifully finely welded upper section in tubular steel that is socketed into this nice casting here, using the engine as a stressed member, and this cast rear tail section which sort of bolts on. And you'd have to mention that beautiful swing arm, which with its eccentric adjuster, which is just a delight to look at. Now, the weight bias on these is very neutral. It's quoted as roughly 50-50 front and back, and part of that is due to the fact that they've mounted these radiators a fair way forward so that they can keep the engine really close to the front forks. And overall, it's just a very pretty motorcycle, and even today it still gets a lot of envious looks on the road. Now, the TnT hasn't been without its issues. The early models were subject to a number of factory recalls. The most common problem that they had was the hot start problem. This was due to clearance problems with the gear on the clutch between it and the alternator drive, which often resulted in the alternator drive shaft breaking due to the fact that when the engine got hot, the clearances went negative and there was actually, the shaft was stressed. The side effect of that negative clearance, of course, was that when the engine was hot, the starter motor had difficulty turning the engine over, hence the name hot start problem. It was also about this time that they upgraded the starter motor as well. Now, on my bike, the Z25 gear and shaft has been upgraded, the clutch basket has been replaced, and the starter motor was replaced. I also had the stepper motor replaced at the same time because it was playing up. Now, the stepper motor regulates the air bypass system, which alters the idle mixture. This really comes into play when the engine is cold, to enrichen the idle mixture to make the engine easier to start. When the stepper valve sticks, it usually sticks in the full rich position, and the symptoms of this are excessive quantities of black smoke out the exhaust and fouling of plugs. You also find perhaps that the bike will idle at slightly different RPMs when that stepper motor gets sticky. They actually changed the design of the stepper motor slightly to overcome those problems. Now, the early dashes also had some issues and were prone to failure from voltage spikes. For example, when you put the motorcycle on a charger or change the battery in and out and such things like that. Mine was replaced in the first year, so most of those electrical issues like that would have been resolved by now if you're looking at a second-hand bike from this era. The other problem I had was with the Speedo Sensor. Now, there are two types. This one has the early type. They're both mounted down here and use the bolts on the rear disc to sense the rotation of the wheel. The early type is very easily damaged, whether it's by a wheel change or just by ham-fistedness, and you really have to keep an eye on its adjustment. If the clearance is too little, it's likely to get caught by the bolts on the rear disc and get damaged, or if the clearance is too wide, you'll get unreliable speed reading as such. One of the other things the factory also updated in the first few years was the fuel map. The initial fuel map was pretty poor, and the engine ran excessively rich a lot of the time. You'd go for a ride and really people would comment on the cloud of black smoke that came out of the back of this bike when you opened the throttle, and you'd smell of petrol when you came home. Now, it took a couple of years before they sorted out those fueling issues, but to get the best out of these, there's a couple of other things that you really need to do. Now, there's a couple of air flaps in the air box and also a exit valve or exhaust valve down underneath the engine there, and in reality the Benelli TnT performs best if you remove those two. The flaps in the airbox had a tendency to fail in the closed position, which was a bit annoying, and the exit valve could also get sucked closed against the spring pressure under very heavy acceleration. And I must admit, after a year or two, the cables got pretty tired, and they didn't perform as well as they should. They were really placed there to reduce the noise levels of the motorcycle, because they sort of cut out at 4,000 RPM just after the European noise tests, I believe. That's why they chose that particular RPM. And I never noticed any improvement in low-end torque with them in. There was just a nasty flat spot. But you will need to retune the idle mixture a little bit if you take those out, because the bike will run a little bit leaner once they're out, and you will need to get the idle mixture altered a little bit. And certainly the bike seems to rev more freely and just performs a lot better without those two items in there. Actually, I actually have the air flaps here. This is the air flap, and it's just pulled by this cable. So spring pressure held it shut, and as you can see, it was pretty easy for them to go out of whack. But really, it's the riding experience that you buy a TnT for. The riding experience of the TnT is just fabulous. The suspension is really good, the brakes are brilliant, and the power delivery is just linear and very torquey. With my style of riding, I mean, I'm not really I guess, a fast rider in the fact that it's rather difficult to go fast on our roads without losing your license. So I stick mainly to the tight, twisty roads, and on those sorts of roads, the TnT is brilliant. It has razor-like handling, and it just changes direction just before you even think about it. It's just got that, it just sort of knows what you're thinking. The brakes are just really, really good, and the rear brake is also quite usable for stabilising you when you're braking deep into corners. But overall, this is probably one of the best motorcycles from a handling point of view that I've ridden to date. And I have ridden a lot of motorcycles, though I must admit this is probably the latest in the 21st century that I've ridden. So it shows you that I am falling up behind a bit in that regards. Now, the suspension on my particular bike, I've adjusted a little bit from factory. The front suspension I've left at the stock preload setting for the spring, and the same with the rear. I've tried other settings, but the stock settings seem to work really well for my body weight, and it sort of is just right. It's not oversprung, not undersprung. The factory really got it right on those settings. Same with the rebound damping, front and back. The rebound damping on the front is at the factory setting and works really well. On the back, I've given it a little bit more rebound damping. But the major change I've made is that I have wound out the compression damping, both front and back. And primarily that's due to our poor roads, and it just makes the bike a lot more compliant. Sure, you get a little bit more dive under braking and squatting under acceleration, but on the road you're not really riding the bike 10 tenths, and you really want to be able to ride for a couple of hours without feeling like you've been beaten up. Just winding that compression damping out at both ends made a world of difference to the bike. I should also point out that with this power button on the dash, it has two settings. They are actually two totally independent maps, so if you are looking at developing your own maps, you can always have a backup stock map in the other position. I must admit, from the factory it comes with a slightly detuned map on one position, the ins position, and the full power on the out position on that button. But I've never changed it in 10 years. I've tried the other positions, but it's actually rather hard to tell the difference between the two unless you actually swap between them. They're very similar, and really it was a bit of a waste of time. Now, I thought we'd finish up with some footage through one of our favourite roads just outside of Melbourne and Healesville, the Black Spur. I took this on-bike footage a couple of years ago. Actually, it was more than a couple of years ago. It wasn't long after the Black Saturday bushfires, which accounts for the lack of understory shrubbery, you might say. But enjoy.